Right from the beginning, the film grounds Dre's story in a sense of loss and instability that quietly shapes everything that follows. Growing up in Detroit with just his mother after his father's death already places him in an emotionally vulnerable position, even before the relocation is introduced. There's an unspoken weight in that dynamic. The absence of a father figure, the pressure on Sherry as a single parent, and the subtle way Dre has had to grow up faster than he probably should have. So when the move to Beijing is announced, it doesn't just feel like a change of scenery, it feels like another disruption layered on top of an already fragile foundation. The relocation itself is handled in a way that emphasizes how sudden and uncontrollable it is from Dre's perspective. There's no sense of gradual adjustment or preparation. It's immediate, final, and completely out of his hands. That lack of agency is crucial because it feeds directly into his frustration and resistance. On the flight, his attempt to learn Mandarin from the phrasebook isn't just about language, it's about trying to regain some control in a situation where he feels powerless. But the fact that nothing sticks reinforces the idea that he's completely out of his depth, setting up the cultural and emotional isolation that defines his early experience in Beijing. Once they arrive, the film leans heavily into sensory disorientation. Everything is unfamiliar, not in a dramatic or exaggerated way, but in small, relatable details. The cramped apartment, the unfamiliar surroundings, even something as simple as a cartoon being dubbed in another language. That SpongeBob moment might seem minor on the surface, but it's actually doing a lot of work. It shows how even the most comforting, universal things from his old life are now inaccessible to him. It's not just that he's in a new place. He's cut off from the small pieces of normalcy that used to ground him. Harry's introduction adds a brief sense of warmth and possibility, acting as one of the few welcoming elements in an otherwise alien environment. His casual friendliness and mention of the park suggest that there might be a way for Dre to integrate, but even that optimism is fragile. The film doesn't rush into making Dre feel at home. Instead, it allows that sense of hope to exist alongside his discomfort, which makes the eventual setbacks feel more grounded and believable. The hot water incident is a perfect example of how the film uses simple, everyday problems to highlight deeper cultural barriers. What should be a straightforward task becomes frustratingly complicated because of the language gap. Dre's inability to communicate turns a minor inconvenience into a moment of helplessness, reinforcing how disconnected he is from his surroundings. And then there's Mr. Han's introduction, which is deliberately awkward and almost absurd. His focus on catching the fly instead of helping Dre immediately creates a sense of unpredictability around him. At this point, he doesn't come across as wise or guiding. He's distant, odd, and somewhat frustrating, which makes their eventual relationship feel more earned later on. The park sequence further builds on Dre's struggle to find his place socially. His attempt to join the basketball game isn't just about sports, it's about trying to fit in, to prove that he belongs. But his lack of skill and the way the other kids gradually exclude him highlight how quickly that effort collapses. The ping-pong moment that follows adds a layer of subtle humiliation, showing that even when he tries to reclaim some sense of confidence, he's still outmatched. These moments stack on top of each other, creating a pattern of small failures that slowly chip away at his self-esteem. Meng's introduction shifts the tone, offering a rare moment of connection. What makes their interaction effective is how natural it feels. There's no forced drama or exaggerated romance. It's simple, curious, and slightly awkward in a way that feels genuine for their age. The language barrier, which has been a source of frustration for Dre, suddenly disappears when she speaks English, creating a moment of relief and ease. Even the detail of her touching his hair adds a layer of cultural curiosity, showing how both characters are learning about each other in small, human ways. But that sense of comfort is intentionally short-lived. Cheng's arrival disrupts the scene with immediate physical dominance, and the shift in tone is sharp. There's no build-up, just sudden aggression that establishes him as a threat right away. What makes this confrontation particularly effective is how one-sided it is. Dre doesn't just lose the fight, he's completely overwhelmed, both physically and emotionally. The repeated knockdowns emphasize his helplessness, while the lack of restraint from Cheng makes the situation feel genuinely hostile rather than just competitive. The aftermath of that encounter is just as important as the fight itself. Dre's reaction pushing Meng away when she tries to help reveals a deeper layer of vulnerability. It's not just about physical pain, it's about pride, embarrassment, and the fear of being seen as weak. That moment captures the internal conflict he's dealing with, where his desire for connection clashes with his instinct to protect his dignity. The following morning continues to explore that theme of concealment. Covering his bruises with makeup and trying to hide them under a cap isn't just about avoiding trouble, it's about maintaining a sense of control over how he's perceived. But the school environment quickly strips that away. The principal forcing him to remove the cap is a small but significant moment, because it publicly exposes what he was trying to hide. And when his mother questions him, his lie reflects a common instinct in situations like this, to downplay pain rather than confront it. School itself becomes an extension of his struggles rather than a refuge. The presence of Cheng and his group ensures that there's no safe space for Dre to recover or regroup. Even his interaction with Mei during lunch, which starts off relatively calm, is overshadowed by tension. Her explanation of Cheng's behavior adds context, but it doesn't reduce the threat he poses. When Cheng knocks over Dre's tray, it's not just an act of bullying, it's a deliberate assertion of dominance in a public setting, reinforcing the power imbalance between them. Dre's attempt to mimic kung fu at home introduces an interesting contrast between perception and reality. What he sees on TV is stylized, almost playful, and his imitation reflects that lack of understanding. It's more about venting frustration than actual training. Mr. Deeses. Han interrupting this moment with something as small as a toothpaste cap is a subtle but effective way of snapping him out of that illusion. It's not a dramatic confrontation. It's precise, controlled, and almost effortless, hinting at a level of skill that Dre doesn't yet recognize. The dynamic between Dre and his mother continues to ground the story emotionally. Her reaction to the jacket on the floor might seem minor, but it reinforces her role as someone trying to instill discipline and respect in a situation where everything else feels unstable. And the fact that Mr. Fact, Han observes this quietly adds another layer to his character, suggesting that he's paying attention in ways that aren't immediately obvious. The music room scene with Mei expands on her character while also reinforcing the theme of pressure and expectation. Her talent is clear, but the lack of praise from her teacher highlights a more demanding environment where excellence is expected rather than celebrated. This parallels Dre's own situation in a different way. While he struggles to adapt, she's under pressure to excel, creating a subtle contrast between their experiences. The Forbidden City sequence serves as a turning point in Dre's understanding of his situation. Watching the group practice kung fu introduces a more grounded, disciplined version of what he had been playfully imitating earlier. The precision, synchronization, and intensity of their movements make it clear that this is something serious, something earned through hard work. And when he realizes that Cheng and his friends are part of that group, the dynamic shifts again. They're no longer just bullies, they're trained, skilled, and far more dangerous than he initially thought. This realization feeds directly into his emotional breakdown with his mother. His frustration finally surfaces in a way that feels raw and unfiltered. It's not just about the bullying, it's about everything: the culture shock, the isolation, the sense of not belonging anywhere. His desire to go back home isn't just nostalgia, it's a longing for stability, for something familiar in a world that suddenly feels overwhelming. Sherry's response, while firm, reflects a harsh reality. There's no easy way out of this situation, and her insistence that they have to make it work underscores the film's central theme of adaptation. It's not comforting, but it's honest, and it forces Dre to confront the fact that he can't simply escape his circumstances. Han witnessing this exchange adds a quiet but important shift in perspective. Up until now, he's been distant and somewhat enigmatic, but this moment reveals a hint of empathy. There's a recognition there, as if he understands what Dre is going through on a deeper level, setting the stage for their relationship to evolve. Dre's decision to retaliate the next day marks a significant shift in his behavior. Instead of avoiding conflict, he actively seeks it out, attempting to reclaim some sense of control. The act itself, dumping dirty water from above, is impulsive and symbolic. It's not about winning a fight, it's about striking back in the only way he feels he can. For a brief moment, it gives him a sense of satisfaction, a fleeting feeling of empowerment. But the film doesn't let that moment last. The immediate consequence, Cheng spotting him and giving chase, brings everything crashing back down to reality, reinforcing the idea that actions driven by frustration often escalate rather than resolve conflict. The chase that follows immediately strips away any illusion of control Dre thought he had gained from his small act of revenge. The way he runs through tight, claustrophobic alleyways isn't just about physical escape. It visually reinforces how boxed in he is, both geographically and emotionally. There's no open space, no clear path forward, just narrow routes that inevitably lead to a dead end. And when he finally gets cornered, the tension collapses into something far more brutal and personal. What stands out in this confrontation is the imbalance of power and the way it's framed. Dre isn't just outnumbered, he's completely defenseless. The group dragging him down and Cheng targeting his stomach with repeated blows creates a sense of calculated cruelty rather than impulsive aggression. It's not a fight, it's punishment. And the moment one of the boys hesitates introduces a subtle but important contrast within the group. There's a flicker of doubt, a recognition that this has gone too far, but it's immediately overridden by Cheng's rigid adherence to what he's been taught. That line, "mercy is weakness," doesn't just define his behavior, it reveals how deeply indoctrinated he is. He's not acting out of pure malice alone, but out of a belief system that equates restraint with failure. Mr. Han's intervention shifts the tone of the entire sequence almost instantly. His entrance isn't loud or dramatic. It's controlled, deliberate, and almost understated, which makes the impact of his actions feel even more striking. The way he intercepts Cheng's strike mid-motion and redirects him with minimal effort establishes a completely different understanding of strength. There's no wasted movement, no aggression, no visible strain. It's not about overpowering, it's about control. And when the rest of the boys rush him, expecting a conventional fight, the choreography subverts that expectation entirely. Mr. Rua. Han doesn't meet force with force. He lets their momentum work against them. It's a visual demonstration of philosophy through action, where defense becomes a form of dominance without ever appearing aggressive. That restraint is what makes the sequence feel almost surreal. In a typical confrontation, you'd expect escalation, more strikes, more intensity. But here, the absence of offense becomes the defining feature. It creates a kind of quiet authority around Mr. Han, where his skill feels less like something he's performing and more like something he simply embodies. By the time the boys retreat, it's not because they've been beaten in the traditional sense, but because they've encountered something they don't understand. The transition to Mr. Han's home slows things down, allowing the film to shift from external conflict to internal curiosity. The use of fire cupping as a healing method adds a cultural and tactile dimension to the scene. It's not just about relieving pain, it's about introducing Dre to a different way of understanding the body and recovery. The immediate relief he feels contrasts sharply with the violence he just endured, creating a sense of calm after chaos. And that contrast feeds directly into his curiosity. For the first time, his interest in kung fu isn't rooted in imitation or frustration, it's genuine. The conversation that follows is crucial because it reframes everything Dre thinks he wants. His questions come from a place of awe and desperation. He's seen something extraordinary, and he wants access to it. But Mr. Han's response deliberately resists that impulse. By explaining that his knowledge comes from his father and that he's never trained anyone before, he establishes a boundary that makes the idea of teaching feel significant rather than casual. And when Dre asks to be trained specifically to fight Cheng, the refusal isn't just about denying him, it's about correcting his intention. This is where the philosophical divide becomes clear. Dre views kung fu as a tool for retaliation, a way to reclaim power and dignity. Mr. Tino. Han, on the other hand, presents it as something rooted in discipline and self-control. The tension between those perspectives drives the scene, especially when Dre challenges the idea by pointing out that Cheng clearly hasn't learned those values. Mr. Say. Han's response that they are products of their teaching adds nuance to the conflict. It shifts the focus away from individual blame and toward the system that shaped them. The visit to the Fighting Dragon Kung Fu Academy brings that system into full view. The environment itself feels structured and intense, but it's the behavior of Master Li that defines it. His reaction to hesitation is immediate and harsh, reinforcing a culture where compassion is not just discouraged, but punished. The physical reprimand of the student isn't just about discipline, it's about instilling fear. And his speech to the class makes it clear that the goal isn't improvement or balance, but domination. The idea that an opponent should be left unable to fight again reveals a philosophy rooted in finality, where victory is measured by destruction rather than control. This directly contrasts with what the audience has just seen from Mr. Han, where one teaches restraint, the other demands excess. Where one avoids unnecessary harm, the other insists on it. And that contrast becomes even more pronounced when Cheng points out Mr. Han. The accusation reframes the earlier encounter, but Mr. Han's explanation remains calm and measured, refusing to escalate the situation verbally even when provoked. Master Li's demand for an immediate fight is less about justice and more about asserting authority. It's a challenge designed to reinforce his dominance within his own space, and when Mr. Han refuses, it's not out of fear, but out of principle. The blocking of the exit turns the situation into a standoff, where the tension isn't physical yet, but it's clearly building towards something inevitable. The introduction of the tournament as a solution is a strategic shift. It transforms a chaotic, uncontrolled conflict into something structured and public. Instead of hidden confrontations in alleys, the fight is moved into an arena with rules and expectations. But even within that agreement, there's an undercurrent of threat. Master Li's warning ensures that the stakes remain high, turning the tournament into more than just a competition. It becomes a test of commitment and consequence. Dre's reaction once they leave highlights the gap between agreement and reality. In the moment, the solution might have seemed reasonable, but now it feels overwhelming. The idea of facing Cheng in front of a crowd amplifies his fear, turning what was once a private struggle into a public challenge. His doubt isn't just about skill, it's about belief in himself, something that's been steadily eroded up to this point. Mr. Prast. Han's reassurance reframes the situation again, not by promising victory, but by redefining what Dre is actually learning. By stating that Master Li's teachings are a distortion of Kung Fu, he positions their training as something fundamentally different. It's not about preparing for a fight in the conventional sense. It's about reshaping how Dre understands conflict altogether. When Dre shows up early the next morning, there's a noticeable shift in his energy. The eagerness is there, but it's still mixed with a kind of naive enthusiasm. His exaggerated poses and attempts to impress reveal that he's still approaching this from a surface-level understanding. He's mimicking what he thinks Kung Fu looks like, not realizing how far removed that is from the reality he's about to experience. The vase incident reinforces that immaturity. It's a small mistake, but it underscores his lack of awareness and control. And Mr. Han's response once again avoids confrontation, choosing instead to redirect the situation into something instructional. The introduction of the jacket routine is deliberately underwhelming, almost anticlimactic. There's no dramatic training montage, no immediate action, just repetition of a simple task. What makes this sequence effective is how it plays with expectation. Both Dre and the audience anticipate something more traditional, something visibly aligned with martial arts training. Instead, they're given something mundane to the point of frustration, and that frustration is essential because it mirrors Dre's internal resistance. He doesn't understand the purpose, but he continues anyway, driven by the promise of something greater. The subtle change in his behavior at home, hanging up his jacket without being told, signals that something is already shifting beneath the surface. It's not about the action itself, but about the habit being formed. Discipline is being introduced in a way that doesn't feel like discipline yet, which makes it more effective. As the days repeat, the monotony becomes almost oppressive. The lack of variation tests, Dre's patience pushing him toward the breaking point. His attempt to cheat isn't just about laziness. It's about desperation for progress, for something that feels meaningful. And Mr. Han's awareness of it reinforces the idea that this process is intentional, that nothing is being overlooked. Dre's interpretation of the lesson as respect for his mother adds an emotional layer to the routine. It shows that he's trying to find meaning, trying to connect the exercise to something tangible. And while that interpretation isn't entirely wrong, Mr. Cibola Wong, Han's lack of confirmation keeps the true purpose just out of reach, maintaining the tension between understanding and confusion. The festival sequence provides a brief emotional release, allowing the story to breathe. Mr. Seal. Han's presence in a more casual setting humanizes him further, while his acknowledgement of Dre as his first student adds weight to their relationship. It's no longer just a temporary arrangement, it's something more personal. Dre's meeting with Maying during the festival continues to build their connection in a way that feels sincere and understated. The gift of the CD reflects effort and thought, showing a different side of Dre that isn't defined by conflict. and the story of the cowherd and weaver girl subtly mirrors their situation. Two people separated by forces beyond their control, finding brief moments of connection despite those barriers. Their promise to support each other ties their individual goals together, creating a sense of mutual investment. It's not just about romance, it's about encouragement, about having someone who believes in you when everything else feels uncertain. The kiss, while brief, represents a moment of clarity and connection that stands in contrast to the chaos surrounding Dre's life. Returning to the training, the repetition feels heavier than before because the audience now understands what Dre stands to lose if he doesn't improve. His eventual outburst is inevitable. The frustration that's been building finally surfaces, and it's not just directed at the routine, it's directed at the fear of inadequacy, the doubt that this process is leading anywhere. Mr. So. Han's response to that frustration is where the training finally reveals itself. By stripping away the jacket and asking Dre to repeat the motion, he isolates the movement from its context. And when he begins to demonstrate how each action translates into defense, the entire routine is recontextualized. What once seemed pointless becomes precise, purposeful. The moment he starts throwing strikes is the true turning point. There's no warning, no gradual buildup, just immediate application. And Dre's body responds before his mind fully catches up. The reactions are instinctive, not learned in the conscious sense, which is what makes them so powerful. It's the realization that training isn't always about understanding in the moment. It's about conditioning the body to act when it matters most. What makes this turning point so effective is how invisible the transformation feels in the moment. Dre isn't consciously applying techniques. He isn't calculating angles or anticipating strikes. His body simply responds. That instinctive reaction is the payoff of everything that seemed pointless before. The repetition, the frustration, the monotony, it all converges into something that finally makes sense, not intellectually, but physically. And when he manages to push Mr. Han back, even for a second, it's not framed as a victory over his teacher, but as a breakthrough within himself. Mr. Breakthrough within himself. Han's smile in that moment isn't about being impressed by strength. It's about recognizing understanding. The explanation that follows expands the idea of kung fu beyond combat in a way that reframes the entire narrative. By describing it as something present in every action, how you carry yourself, how you respond to situations, how you treat people. The film shifts from a story about learning to fight into a story about learning to live with intention. It's a subtle but important distinction because it removes the idea that the end goal is defeating an opponent. Instead, it becomes about mastering your own behavior, your own reactions, your own mindset. The journey to the Wudong Mountains deepens that philosophy by physically removing Dre from the chaos of the city and placing him in an environment that feels timeless and meditative. The shift in setting is significant, not just visually, but thematically. Away from the noise and pressure of his daily life, Dre is exposed to a space where stillness and focus take priority. It's not just a training location, it's a place designed to slow him down, to make him observe rather than react. The encounter with the woman and the cobra is one of the most symbolic moments in the film, and it works precisely because it challenges Dre's instinct to interpret everything through a surface-level lens. At first glance, it looks like imitation, like she's reacting to the snake. But Mr. Fair. Han's correction forces a complete reversal of perspective. The idea that the snake is responding to her calmness introduces a concept that goes beyond physical technique. It suggests that control doesn't come from force or dominance, but from presence, an internal stillness so complete that it influences the world around it. When they reach Dragonwell, the story Mr. Han shares initially feels almost playful, even a bit mythical. The idea of magical water that grants invincibility sounds like something Dre would want to believe in, especially given his situation. And his reaction, laughing it off while still drinking from it, captures that mix of skepticism and hope. But the real lesson isn't in the water itself. It's in what follows. The explanation using the reflection in the water ties everything together in a way that's both simple and profound. The surface of the water becomes a metaphor for the mind, calm, undisturbed, clear, and in that clarity, the world reflects itself. The distinction, Mr. Stoppers. Han draws between doing nothing and being truly still is crucial. One is passive, the other is controlled. One is empty, the other is focused. When Dre realizes that the woman wasn't controlling the snake but herself, it marks a shift in his understanding. For the first time, He's grasping the idea that power doesn't come from external action, but from internal discipline. Naming it the cobra stance gives the concept a form, something tangible that Dre can latch onto, but the emphasis on it taking a lifetime to master keeps it grounded. There's no shortcut here, no quick mastery, just a long, ongoing process of refinement. And that idea carries into their training on the mountain. The use of bamboo sticks, the natural surroundings, the fading light. It all contributes to a sense of immersion, as if Dre is stepping into a tradition rather than just learning techniques. The train ride back provides a quiet moment of contrast. After all the intensity, the exhaustion feels earned. Dre falling asleep against Mr. Han's shoulder isn't just physical fatigue, it's a kind of surrender, a trust that's been building between them. And Mr. Han carrying him inside reinforces that bond, shifting their relationship further into something resembling family. From that point on, Dre's fascination with the cobra stance shows that something has fundamentally changed in how he approaches training. Instead of resisting or questioning, he becomes curious, almost obsessed with understanding that state of stillness. His sketches of the woman and the snake reflect a desire to capture something intangible, to make sense of a concept that isn't easily explained through words or movement alone. The curtain training introduces a completely different kind of challenge, one that strips away visual cues and forces Dre to rely on instinct and awareness. By removing sight, Mr. Han eliminates anticipation based on observation, pushing Dre to develop a deeper sensitivity to movement and timing. At first, it's overwhelming. The unpredictability creates frustration, and the repeated hits reinforce how dependent Dre still is on seeing what's coming. His reaction begging for it to stop shows that he's being pushed beyond his comfort zone in a way that feels almost unfair. But that's where the shift happens. Without visual input, Dre is forced to listen, to feel, to react without thinking. And slowly, those reactions begin to sharpen. His body adapts, becoming more fluid, more responsive. The frustration doesn't disappear, but it transforms into focus. Each session builds on the last, not through obvious progression, but through subtle improvements in timing and awareness. The increasing intensity of the drills reflects a growing confidence from Mr. Han in Dre's ability to handle more. There's a sense that the training is no longer just about teaching basics. It's about pushing limits, testing endurance, refining precision, and yet the decision to pause training after several days introduces an important counterbalance. The idea that something pulled too tight will break applies not just physically but mentally. It acknowledges that growth requires recovery, that progress isn't constant motion but a balance between effort and rest. Dre's reaction to the break highlights how far he's come. Earlier, he resisted training because it felt pointless. Now, he embraces the opportunity to step away, not out of frustration, but because he's earned it. His day with Mei-Ying reinforces that shift, offering a glimpse of a life that isn't defined by conflict or pressure. Their time together feels light, spontaneous, and genuine, something Dre hasn't experienced since arriving in Beijing. The sudden change when her audition is moved forward reintroduces the reality of their individual pressures. While Dre has been struggling to find his place, Mei-Ying has been working towards something with clear expectations and consequences. Her departure is abrupt, leaving Dre in a moment of uncertainty. But his decision to go after her shows initiative, a willingness to support someone else despite his own challenges. Watching her perform allows him to see her in her element, under pressure, striving for something important. The lack of visible praise from her teacher mirrors earlier scenes, reinforcing the idea that excellence here is expected, not celebrated. Dre's applause stands out because it comes from a place of genuine admiration, not obligation. It's a simple gesture, but it carries emotional weight. Her father's reaction introduces another layer of conflict, one rooted in cultural expectations and priorities. His disapproval isn't framed as outright hostility, but as concern shaped by a different value system, one where focus and discipline take precedence over personal relationships. Mei-Ying's decision to distance herself from Dre isn't driven by a lack of feeling, but by pressure and responsibility. That makes the separation feel more painful, because it's not caused by conflict between them, but by circumstances around them. Dre's devastation following that moment feels quieter, more internal. There's no outburst, no immediate reaction, just a sense of loss that lingers as he tries to process it. And when he arrives at Mr. Han's place, expecting familiarity and structure, What he finds instead is something completely unexpected. The scene with the car shifts the emotional tone dramatically. Up until now, Mr. Han has been composed, controlled, almost unreadable at times. Seeing him in this state, drunk, destructive, emotionally unguarded, reveals a side of him that reframes everything. The act of destroying the car isn't random. It's ritualistic, tied to something deeply personal and unresolved. The discovery of the newspaper clipping provides context, but it's Mr. Han's confession that gives it weight. The loss of his wife and son, combined with the guilt of being responsible, transforms his character from a mentor into someone carrying immense pain. The detail that he can't remember what they were arguing about adds a layer of tragedy that feels almost unbearable. It's not just the loss. It's the absence of closure, the inability to make sense of the final moments. The yearly ritual of rebuilding and destroying the car becomes a physical manifestation of that unresolved grief. It's an attempt to recreate the past, to force a memory to return, even if it means reliving the pain. But the fact that it never works reinforces the idea that some things can't be undone or fully understood. The moment where he sings his wife's song is particularly powerful because it strips away any remaining distance between him and Dre. It's intimate, vulnerable, and deeply human. There's no teacher, no student, just a man confronting his loss. Dre's response in this situation marks one of his most significant moments of growth. Instead of retreating or reacting impulsively, he stays present. He listens, he supports, and he shows empathy in a way that mirrors what Mr. Han has been teaching him all along. Helping him out of the car isn't just a physical act. It's symbolic of stepping into a more mature role, one where he's capable of giving support rather than just receiving it. Asking to continue training in that moment ties everything together. It's no longer about revenge or proving something. It's about commitment, about continuing the process despite everything. And Mr. Han's agreement, after regaining his composure, feels like a mutual understanding rather than a simple continuation of lessons. Sherry's arrival and her reaction provide a final grounding element, reminding us of Dre's external world. Her pride reflects the visible change in him, not just in skill, but in attitude and focus. And from that point forward, his rapid progress doesn't feel sudden or unearned. It feels like the natural result of everything he's been through, everything he's learned, and everything he's beginning to understand. By the time Dre reaches this stage in his training, the change isn't just visible in his technique, it's embedded in his presence. The sharpness in his movements isn't about speed alone, it's about intention. Every step, every shift in weight, every reaction feels deliberate, as if his body is no longer guessing but understanding. His balance, in particular, becomes a reflection of something deeper. Earlier in the film, imbalance defined him emotionally, physically, culturally. Now, that stability signals alignment, a kind of internal grounding that extends beyond the mat. And with that comes confidence, not the loud, defensive kind he tried to project before, but a quieter assurance that doesn't need to prove itself. The visit to the tournament arena before the competition serves as a psychological preparation as much as a physical one. It allows Dre to confront the reality of what's ahead without the immediate pressure of performance. Mr. Han's advice in that moment is crucial because it reframes the stakes entirely. By removing the obsession with winning or losing, he shifts Dre's focus towards something more sustainable: honor, respect, self-conduct. It's a subtle recalibration, but it prevents the competition from becoming just another form of validation. Instead, it becomes an extension of everything he's learned. The gift of the uniform carries symbolic weight that goes beyond aesthetics. Inspired by Bruce Lee, it connects Dre to a legacy, to an idea of martial arts that transcends his personal struggle. It's not just about looking the part. It's about stepping into a lineage of discipline, philosophy, and identity. And Mr. Han's final lesson before the tournament distills the film's core message into something simple but enduring. The inevitability of being knocked down isn't presented as a failure, but as a constant. What defines a person is the response, the decision to rise again. That idea doesn't just apply to the upcoming fight. It echoes through everything Dre has experienced since arriving in Beijing. Their embrace in that moment feels earned because it's built on shared growth. When Dre calls him his best friend, it's not framed as a sentimental exaggeration, but as a recognition of what Mr. Han has become in his life: a mentor, a guide, a stabilizing force. The act of writing the letter in Chinese further reinforces how much Dre has changed. Earlier, language was a barrier that isolated him. Now, he's using it as a bridge, a way to communicate sincerity and respect in a form that matters. The scene with Meiying's father is particularly effective because it strips away any sense of confrontation. Dre doesn't argue or defend himself. He presents his case with humility. His words aren't about convincing, but about expressing growth. By acknowledging the impact Meiying has had on him, he reframes their relationship as something meaningful rather than distracting. It's not a grand gesture, but it's honest, and that honesty carries weight. The father's response, delivered in Chinese and translated through Meiying, maintains a cultural distance while still allowing for connection. The agreement that she will attend the tournament feels like a quiet acceptance, not just of Dre, but of the effort he's made. When the day of the competition finally arrives, the atmosphere shifts dramatically. The packed arena introduces a scale that contrasts with the intimate struggles Dre has faced up to this point. Everything is louder, more intense, more exposed. The presence of Meiying and her family in the crowd adds emotional stakes, while Cheng and his team bring a sense of looming threat. The visual of them warming up, focused and disciplined, reinforces that Dre isn't stepping into unfamiliar territory anymore. He's stepping into their world. Watching Cheng fight before his own match serves as a psychological test. Dre isn't just observing skill, he's confronting fear in its most tangible form. Cheng's efficiency, the precision of his strikes, the lack of hesitation, it all reinforces the gap that once existed between them. And that moment of intimidation carries into Dre's first match, where his nerves manifest in a small but telling mistake. Stepping out of bounds before the fight even begins isn't about clumsiness, it's about doubt creeping back in. Mr. Terry's problem. Han's intervention at that point is less about instruction and more about grounding. By telling Dre to block everything out, he's not asking him to ignore reality, but to return to the internal focus he's been building. And when Dre steps back onto the mat, the shift is immediate. The movements are cleaner, more decisive. The takedown and follow-up kick aren't flashy. They're precise, controlled, and effective. That first win isn't just a victory in the bracket, it's a confirmation that his training holds up under pressure. As the matches progress, the momentum builds in a way that feels earned rather than convenient. Each victory adds a layer of confidence, not in the sense of arrogance, but in trust in his training, in his instincts, in his ability to respond. And paralleling this, Cheng's progression through the bracket reinforces the inevitability of their final confrontation. Where Dre's growth is rooted in discipline and understanding, Cheng's dominance remains tied to aggression and conditioning. Both are advancing, but through fundamentally different philosophies. The semifinal match introduces a darker turn, exposing the consequences of Master Li's teachings in a more explicit way. Liang's targeted attacks on Dre's leg aren't random. They're calculated, strategic, and deliberately harmful. It's not about winning within the rules, but about ensuring Dre can't continue. The repeated strikes to the same spot create a sense of inevitability, as if the outcome is being forced rather than earned. And while the disqualification technically gives Dre the win, it feels hollow in the moment because of the damage done. The injury itself becomes a new kind of obstacle, one that tests Dre in a way that goes beyond skill. The doctor's verdict introduces reality into the situation. This isn't just about willpower, it's about physical limitation. The suggestion that he shouldn't continue isn't framed as weakness, but as practicality, and that's what makes Dre's decision more significant. When he asks for one more use of the fire cupping, it's not out of desperation alone, it's out of belief in what he's learned. Mr. Han's hesitation reflects the dual role he plays as both teacher and protector. He knows the risk, understands the consequences, and doesn't want to see Dre pushed beyond his limits. But Dre's response, echoing the lesson about getting back up, turns the situation into something personal. He's not asking for permission to win, he's asking for the chance to choose. That distinction is what ultimately convinces Mr. Han. The agreement isn't enthusiastic, it's heavy, reluctant, but rooted in respect for Dre's determination. The final match begins with that tension fully intact. Dre's physical struggle is immediately apparent, and Cheng's opening strike reinforces the vulnerability of his injury. Every movement carries risk, every step looks unstable, but within that limitation, Dre finds a different kind of focus. When he manages to take the lead with quick, precise scoring, it signals that his understanding hasn't been compromised, even if his body has. Master Li's instruction to target the injured leg brings the philosophical conflict to its peak. Cheng's hesitation in that moment is subtle but important. It suggests that something has shifted within him, even if only slightly. But the weight of his training, the authority of his master, overrides that instinct. The strike he delivers isn't just physical, it's symbolic of the system he's been shaped by. As the final round approaches, everything narrows down to a single point. Dre's inability to stand on both feet forces him into a position that mirrors the lesson from the mountain. The one-legged stance isn't just a necessity. It becomes a reflection of balance under pressure, of stillness in chaos. The memory of the woman in the cobra isn't just recalled, it's embodied. In that moment, Dre isn't reacting to Cheng, he's centering himself. The fact that Cheng begins to mirror him without realizing, it completes the thematic circle. The same principle introduced earlier of influence through stillness plays out in real time. Dr. isn't controlling Cheng, but his composure is shaping the rhythm of the moment. And when Cheng finally attacks, Dre's response is instinctive, fluid, and decisive. The overhead kick isn't just a display of skill, it's the culmination of everything he's learned, executed without hesitation. The aftermath of the fight shifts the focus away from victory and toward respect. Cheng handing over the trophy marks a quiet but powerful transformation. It's not forced, not exaggerated. It's a recognition, an acknowledgement that goes beyond the result of the match. The bow from the other students toward Mr. Bard. Han extends that respect further, validating his philosophy in contrast to Master Li's approach. The final exchange between Dre and Mr. Han is understated, but it carries the weight of the entire journey. The smile they share isn't about winning a tournament, it's about what that journey required, the discipline, the setbacks, the growth. And in that quiet moment, the film's central idea settles in, not as a lesson being told, but as something that's been lived. Before this version of The Karate Kid, 2010, even had a chance to speak for itself, the conversation around it was already loud, and not in a good way. Because let's be honest, remaking something this iconic is never a safe move. For a lot of people, the original The Karate Kid, 1984, wasn't just a movie, it was a memory. It had heart, simplicity, and characters that stuck with you in a way that felt effortless rather than engineered. It represented a certain kind of storytelling that didn't rely on spectacle, but on sincerity, and that's a difficult thing to replicate, let alone reinterpret. So the moment a remake was announced, the reaction wasn't curiosity, it was suspicion. Why touch something that already works? Why revisit a story that didn't need fixing? There's an almost protective instinct audiences develop toward films like this, where nostalgia isn't just affection, it's ownership. And once that feeling sets in, any attempt to revisit the material starts off at a disadvantage, because it has to prove it deserves to exist at all. And then came the casting. Jaden Smith stepping into the lead role immediately divided audiences. Before anyone had even seen a single frame, opinions were already locked in, shaped more by perception than performance. There was this assumption that the film was relying more on name recognition than substance, that it was leaning on familiarity in the wrong way, rather than earning its place through storytelling. And that perception created a kind of resistance that the film had to fight against from the very beginning. Because when audiences walk in expecting something to fail, every small flaw gets amplified, every misstep feels intentional, and even the strengths struggle to break through that initial bias. Add to that the internet backlash that started building early, criticism about the concept, the tone, even the idea that this remake might completely miss the point. And suddenly, the film wasn't just another release, it became something people were ready to reject before it even arrived. The narrative around it became almost more important than the film itself. Conversations weren't about what it could be, but about what it shouldn't be. And that kind of discourse creates a very specific environment, where the film isn't just being judged on its own terms, it's being measured against expectations it didn't necessarily create, but still has to answer for. Because we've seen this before, remakes can go either way. Sometimes they surprise you, reimagining a story in a fresh, meaningful way that justifies their existence by offering a new perspective. They take familiar foundations and build something that feels relevant to a different time, a different audience. Other times, they feel hollow, like they exist only because they can, not because they should. Like an echo of something that once mattered, but without the emotional resonance that gave it life in the first place. And audiences are very aware of that distinction, even if they don't always articulate it directly. So walking into The Karate Kid, 2010, there's this weight hanging over it, not just expectations, but doubt. a sense that this could either be a respectful reinterpretation or just another unnecessary attempt to recreate something that didn't need to be touched in the first place. And that tension, that skepticism, is exactly where the film's journey begins. It's not just trying to tell a story, it's trying to justify its own existence at the same time. And that's a much harder position to be in than simply being a new film with no baggage. So after all that skepticism, after the doubt, the criticism, the expectations stacked against it, what does The Karate Kid, 2010, actually feel like when you finally sit down and watch it? The answer isn't simple, because this is one of those films that lives right in the middle, not a disaster, but not a triumph either. It occupies that space where you're constantly aware of both its strengths and its limitations, often within the same scene. On one hand, it's surprisingly watchable. There are moments where it genuinely pulls you in, where the story clicks, the performances settle, and you start to feel invested in what's happening on screen. There's a rhythm to certain sequences that works, a sense that the film understands the emotional beats it's trying to hit, even if it doesn't always land them with full force. It's not the train wreck many people expected going in. In fact, at times, it works better than you'd think, finding small pockets of authenticity that remind you why this story has endured in the first place. But then, it never quite rises above that. It doesn't fully captivate. It doesn't consistently excite, and it definitely doesn't leave a lasting impact the way a film like this should. You're watching it and you're engaged, but you're rarely moved in a way that lingers. The emotional peaks feel contained rather than expansive, like they reach the right note but don't sustain it long enough to resonate. And because of that, the film never quite crosses the line from being simply functional to being memorable. And that's where the mixed reception comes from. Because for every moment that works, there's another that holds it back. For every strong scene, there's something that feels flat or overly familiar. Something that reminds you that you've seen this done before and done with more impact. It's a constant push and pull between potential and limitation, between what the film achieves and what it almost achieves. And that almost becomes the defining feeling of the experience. Some viewers walked away pleasantly surprised, expecting the worst and getting something decent. For them, the film exceeded the low bar that had been set by all the early skepticism. Others couldn't get past its flaws, seeing it as a watered-down version of something far better, something that captures the outline but misses the essence. And honestly, both reactions make sense. Because the film exists in that gray area where interpretation depends heavily on what you bring into it. Your expectations, your attachment to the original, your willingness to accept a familiar story told in a familiar way. This is a film that isn't terrible but isn't great either. It sits in that frustrating space where you can see what it's trying to do, you can even appreciate parts of it, but you're always aware that it could have been more. That sense of unrealized potential lingers throughout, shaping how you experience every scene. It's the kind of movie you don't hate, but you don't fully love. And in the end, that's exactly why it leaves such a divided impression, because it gives you just enough to stay engaged, but not enough to stay with you. At the heart of The Karate Kid 2010 is a story you already know. Not just in spirit, but almost beat for beat. A kid is pulled out of his comfort zone, dropped into a completely unfamiliar world, struggles to fit in, gets targeted by bullies, and just when things feel unbearable, a quiet, unlikely mentor steps in. What follows is training, discipline, growth, and ultimately, a showdown that promises redemption. It's a formula that's been told countless times, not just in this franchise, but across genres. And here, it plays out exactly the way you expect, without much deviation from the established path. Now, to be fair, that structure isn't the problem. This kind of story works because it's simple, universal, and emotionally accessible. It taps into something fundamental, the desire to overcome adversity, to find strength in moments of vulnerability, to grow into someone stronger than who you were at the beginning. It's the classic underdog journey, the coming-of-age arc, the transformation from weakness to strength, not just physically, but mentally. And when executed with precision, that formula can be incredibly powerful because it resonates on a deeply human level. But the issue is, this version rarely surprises you. Every major turn feels predictable. Every emotional beat arrives right on cue, almost as if it's following a rhythm that's been pre-programmed rather than discovered organically. You can see the trajectory from miles away, and not because it's cleverly set up, but because it's so familiar that your mind fills in the gaps before the film even gets there. There's very little deviation, no real reinvention of the formula. It doesn't challenge the structure, it follows it with a kind of quiet obedience, and that creates a strange experience while watching it. You're not asking what happens next, you're thinking, okay, now this part comes. That shift in engagement changes how you connect with the story. Instead of being pulled forward by curiosity, you're moving along with expectation. And while that can create a sense of comfort, it also limits the film's ability to truly captivate. Because when a story doesn't evolve beyond its blueprint, it starts to feel less like a journey and more like a checklist. Each moment serves a purpose, but rarely goes beyond it. Each scene moves the narrative forward, but doesn't necessarily deepen it in a meaningful way. And while the film never completely loses your attention, it also never fully earns your emotional investment in the way it could have if it had taken more risks or found new angles within that familiar framework. Still, there's a reason this formula exists. When it works, it connects. It delivers satisfaction in a way that feels almost instinctive, because it taps into something audiences have experienced over and over again but still want to feel. It gives viewers a clear emotional roadmap, something familiar enough to follow without effort, but ideally engaging enough to feel meaningful along the way. And this film does tap into that, just not in a way that feels fresh or truly memorable. It understands the mechanics of the formula, but it doesn't quite capture the magic that makes that formula resonate beyond the surface. It's not broken, but it's also not rebuilt. It simply walks the same path, without carving a new one, without leaving its own distinct imprint on a story that has already proven how powerful it can be when handled with precision and originality. If there's one issue that consistently drags this film down, it's the way it handles time. Because The Karate Kid 2010 doesn't just feel long, it is long, and not in a way that justifies itself through layered storytelling or deeper exploration. We're talking about a story built on a simple, well-known structure, yet it stretches out to nearly 2.5 hours. And almost immediately you start to feel that weight, not because the film is doing too much, but because it often feels like it's doing too little for too long. The opening act takes its time, maybe too much time. There's a sense that the film is overly comfortable in its setup, allowing moments to linger past the point where they've already made their impact. Scenes extend without adding new information or emotional depth. The setup keeps expanding when it should be tightening, like the film is hesitant to move forward. You're waiting for the story to really kick in, for the training, for the transformation, for that central dynamic to take shape, but it takes a while to get there. And that delay matters more than it might seem at first, because in a film like this, momentum is everything. It's not just about what happens, it's about how quickly and effectively the story builds toward those moments. You need that forward drive, the sense that the character is moving toward something, even if the path is difficult. But here, that movement feels stalled early on, like the film is circling its own starting point instead of progressing beyond it. That lack of urgency creates a disconnect, where the audience is ready to engage, but the film hasn't quite caught up to that energy yet. Ironically, once it does pick up, it actually flows better. The second half feels more focused, more aware of what it needs to deliver. The pacing improves. The narrative starts to breathe in the right way, with scenes that feel more purposeful and connected. You get more engagement, more energy, more direction. There's a clearer sense of progression, and the film begins to resemble the kind of story it was always meant to be. But by then, the damage is already done. The early sluggishness lingers in the overall experience, making the entire runtime feel heavier than it might have otherwise. The runtime becomes even more noticeable when you realize how much of it could have been trimmed without losing anything essential. Certain subplots linger beyond their usefulness, extending moments that don't significantly contribute to character development or narrative progression. Some scenes repeat ideas we've already understood, reinforcing points that didn't need repeating. There's a sense that the film is holding on to material simply because it exists, rather than because it serves a clear purpose. And when that happens, even the stronger parts start to feel diluted. Because it's not just about being long, it's about how that length is used. Here, the story doesn't expand, it stretches. It fills space instead of deepening meaning. And in doing so, it loses some of the sharpness and impact it could have had if it trusted its own simplicity. A more restrained approach could have made each moment feel more deliberate, more impactful, rather than blending into a longer, less defined experience. This is a film that might have benefited from restraint. Tighter editing, cleaner pacing, a stronger sense of rhythm that understands when to move forward and when to hold back. Because underneath all of it, there's a story that works. The core is solid. The emotional arc is there. It just takes too long to get where it's going, and that journey feels less engaging than it should because of it. If pacing is what you feel on the surface, the screenplay is what shapes everything underneath. And with The Karate Kid 2010, the writing is where a lot of its strengths and weaknesses begin to show. On one side, there's a foundation that works. The dialogue, at times, feels natural in a way that doesn't draw attention to itself. Certain exchanges, especially between mentor and student, carry a quiet sincerity that gives those moments weight. There's an attempt to ground the story in ideas about discipline, patience, and personal growth, and when those themes come through clearly, they give the film a sense of purpose. You can sense what the film is trying to say about resilience and control, about learning not just how to fight, but how to understand yourself. Those moments provide glimpses of depth, reminding you of the emotional core that this kind of story can have when it's fully realized. But then, there's the other side. Because for every scene that feels grounded, there's another that slips into predictability. The script leans heavily on familiar beats, often choosing the safest possible version of a moment instead of pushing for something deeper or more nuanced. It rarely takes risks with its characters or its dialogue. Instead, it stays within a comfort zone that keeps everything clear but also keeps everything limited. Characters say what you expect them to say. Their lines feel functional rather than revealing, delivering information or emotion in a way that serves the scene but doesn't necessarily elevate it. Situations unfold exactly how you think they will, without subtext or surprise to add layers. And over time, that predictability starts to wear things down, making even well-constructed scenes feel less impactful because they don't offer anything beyond what you've already anticipated. Some character decisions feel forced, less like natural progression and more like the script moving pieces into place to reach the next required moment. Instead of evolving organically, certain actions feel dictated by the structure, as if the characters are following the outline rather than living within it. Emotional moments are present, but not always earned. They exist because the story needs them, not because the build-up has fully justified them. They're written into the narrative, rather than emerging from it in a way that feels inevitable and authentic. There's also a noticeable imbalance in how characters are handled. Some are given space moments where they can breathe, reflect, and reveal something more complex beneath the surface. Others feel underwritten, reduced to simple traits or repetitive behaviors that don't evolve over time, and when that happens, the emotional weight of the story becomes uneven. You might connect with one relationship or one arc, but feel disconnected from others that don't receive the same level of attention. Even the humor and lighter moments, while occasionally effective, feel inconsistent, like they belong to a slightly different version of the film. At times, they add a sense of warmth or levity. At other times, they feel out of place, disrupting the tone rather than complementing it. That inconsistency makes it harder for the film to maintain a cohesive identity, as if it's balancing between different approaches without fully committing to any one of them. And that's really the core issue here. The screenplay knows the story it wants to tell, but it doesn't always know how to elevate it. It follows the structure, it hits the beats, it delivers the message in a clear, accessible way. But it rarely goes beyond that baseline. It doesn't dig deeper into its themes, doesn't challenge its characters in unexpected ways, doesn't explore the emotional complexities that could have made it stand out. And because of that, the film ends up feeling like it's checking boxes, instead of building something truly memorable. Each element is in place, but they don't always come together with the kind of cohesion or depth that turns a solid script into a great one. There's a sense of missed opportunity running through it, a feeling that the story had the potential to say more, to feel more, to resonate more strongly than it ultimately does. There's a solid script somewhere inside this film. You can see glimpses of it in certain scenes, certain exchanges, certain moments that almost break through. But it never fully comes together into something as strong or as impactful as it could have been. Beyond the script and performances, the real question becomes, how well is this story actually put together? And when you look at The Karate Kid 2010 from a directing standpoint, the answer is competent but inconsistent. There's a clear sense that the film is in steady hands. The scenes are structured properly, the story is easy to follow, and nothing ever feels completely out of control. It's polished, it's professional. But that sense of control also comes with a certain restraint, where the direction prioritizes clarity over creativity and consistency over boldness. You can feel that the film is being guided with care, but not necessarily with a strong, distinctive vision that elevates it beyond its foundation. It delivers what's required, but rarely pushes beyond it. And in a film that already leans so heavily on familiarity, that lack of directorial identity becomes even more noticeable. You can tell there's an effort to respect the material and present it in a way that's accessible to a wide audience. There's a kind of carefulness in how the film is constructed, like it's constantly aware of the expectations placed on it and is trying not to alienate anyone in the process. But at the same time, it rarely feels distinctive. That sense of caution becomes part of the problem, because instead of taking ownership of the story and reshaping it with a clear voice, the film often settles into familiarity. There isn't a strong directorial identity shaping the experience in a way that feels personal or bold. Instead, the film often plays it safe, leaning into rhythms we've seen before, rather than creating something visually or emotionally unique. It moves from scene to scene efficiently, almost mechanically at times, but without that extra layer of creative intention that makes individual moments linger in your mind. You see it in how certain sequences are handled. The quieter, emotional scenes sometimes land well, especially when the film slows down and gives its characters space to exist without forcing the moment. In those instances, the direction shows restraint in a way that actually works, allowing subtle performances and small gestures to carry meaning. But other moments, particularly ones that should feel powerful, pass by without leaving much of an impact. The build-up is there, the intention is clear, but the execution stops just short of fully committing. It's like the direction sets things up, but doesn't always push them far enough to reach that emotional peak where a scene truly resonates. There's also a noticeable imbalance in focus. At times, the film seems more interested in expanding its world or stretching certain beats than refining the core narrative. Instead of tightening the story, the direction occasionally allows it to drift, giving too much attention to elements that don't necessarily deepen the experience. That lack of precision contributes directly to the uneven pacing, creating moments where the film feels like it's pausing instead of progressing. It's not that the scenes themselves are ineffective, it's that they're not always placed or shaped in a way that maximizes their impact. And then there's the handling of tone. The film shifts between drama, humor, and action, but those transitions aren't always seamless. Some scenes feel grounded and sincere, anchored in genuine emotion, while others lean into a more conventional, almost formulaic approach that feels disconnected from that sincerity. That inconsistency creates a subtle but noticeable fragmentation, where the film never fully settles into a clear identity. It's as if it's trying to be multiple things at once, without fully committing to any single tone long enough to define itself. That said, it's not without its successes. There are moments where everything aligns, where the direction, performances, and atmosphere come together in a way that feels cohesive and engaging. In those scenes, you get a glimpse of what the film could have been if that level of control and intention had been sustained throughout. There's a sense of clarity in those moments, a feeling that the film knows exactly what it wants to be and how to get there. But those instances are scattered rather than consistent. Overall, the direction doesn't elevate the material as much as it could. It supports the story, it keeps things moving, it ensures that everything remains watchable and coherent. But it rarely transforms the experience into something truly memorable. And in a film like The Karate Kid 2010, where the story is already so familiar, that extra layer of craft is exactly what's needed to make it stand out. Without it, the film remains grounded in competence rather than rising into something more distinctive. If there's one area where The Karate Kid 2010 truly separates itself, it's in how it looks. Because visually, this film does something the original never could. It opens up the world in a way that feels expansive and immersive. Shifting the setting to China isn't just a narrative change, it becomes the film's strongest artistic advantage, giving it a scale and texture that immediately sets it apart. From the very beginning, there's a sense of scope that stands out. Wide landscapes stretch across the frame, city environments feel alive with movement and color, and historic landmarks are presented with a kind of reverence that gives them presence beyond simple location. This isn't just a backdrop, it's an active part of the film's identity. The camera takes its time capturing that, often framing environments in a way that emphasizes their size and significance. You see it in the sweeping shots of open spaces, the rich, saturated tones that fill the frame, the careful composition that makes each location feel almost monumental. Whether it's crowded urban streets or iconic cultural sites, the film consistently leans into its environment, and more often than not, it works. There's a kind of visual immersion here that adds weight to the story, grounding the character's experience in a world that feels both real and overwhelming. It reinforces the idea of displacement, the feeling of being small in a place that's unfamiliar, where everything around you carries a sense of history and scale that you don't yet understand. And in those moments, the cinematography does something the script sometimes struggles with. It makes you feel the experience rather than just observe it. But at the same time, there's a fine line. Because occasionally, the film starts to feel like it's showing off its setting rather than integrating it seamlessly into the narrative. Certain shots linger just a bit too long, drawing attention to their visual appeal without adding new layers to the story. Some sequences feel more like visual showcases than narrative progression, as if the film momentarily shifts its focus from storytelling to presentation. It's almost as if it gets caught between telling a story and presenting a location as a spectacle. Still, even with that, the visual quality remains one of its biggest strengths. The use of color creates a distinct atmosphere. The widescreen framing adds a sense of scale that enhances the viewing experience, and the attention to detail in capturing the environment gives the film a level of polish that's hard to ignore. There's a deliberate effort to make the world feel vivid and expansive, and for the most part, that effort pays off. In fact, there are moments where the visuals carry the film more than the story itself, where the imagery creates a sense of engagement that the narrative doesn't always maintain. And that says a lot, because while the story may feel familiar, the world it exists in feels fresh. And sometimes that contrast is enough to keep you invested, even when everything else is still trying to reach that same level. While the visuals give the film its scale, the music is what quietly carries its emotion. And in The Karate Kid 2010, the score plays a much bigger role than you might initially expect. It operates almost like an emotional guide, stepping in to reinforce what the film is trying to convey when the storytelling itself doesn't fully land the moment. There's a consistent emotional undercurrent running through the film, soft, reflective tones during quieter scenes that try to draw you into the character's internal state, swelling orchestration during moments of growth or realization that signal transformation, and a steady musical progression that attempts to guide you through the journey in a way that feels cohesive. The score works to bridge gaps, to smooth over transitions, to connect moments that might otherwise feel disjointed. In the best moments, it works. The music adds weight to scenes that might otherwise feel flat, giving them a sense of emotional gravity that isn't fully supported by the writing alone. It enhances the atmosphere, deepens the mood, and provides a kind of continuity that helps the film feel more unified. It's subtle in places, more pronounced in others, but consistently present in shaping how you respond to what's happening on screen. At times, it almost feels like the score is doing the emotional, heavy lifting, filling in the spaces where the narrative or performances don't quite reach their full potential. And while that can be effective in the moment, it also highlights where the film itself might be falling short. Because ideally, the music should enhance what's already there, not compensate for what's missing. Still, as a component of the overall experience, it adds a layer of depth that the film benefits from. It may not redefine the story, but it helps carry it forward, giving it a sense of emotional flow that keeps you connected, even when the film itself is still trying to find its balance. You feel it during the training sequences, you hear it in the moments of reflection, and especially in the more dramatic reveals, where the music does a lot of the heavy lifting. It steps in to amplify what the visuals and performances are trying to communicate, often guiding the audience toward the intended emotional response. But like other elements in the film, it's not always perfectly balanced. Sometimes, the emotional cues feel a little too obvious, like the music is telling you how to feel instead of allowing the moment to naturally earn that feeling. There's a certain predictability in how those cues are used, a reliance on familiar musical patterns that mirror the film's broader dependence on established formulas, rather than carving out a distinct identity of its own. Then there's the soundtrack. Beyond the score, the film mixes in contemporary tracks, bringing in a more modern sensibility that sits alongside the traditional themes of discipline and mentorship. At times, this contrast works. It adds energy, keeps the film feeling current, and creates a bridge between the classic structure of the story and a newer audience. But in other moments, it can feel slightly disconnected from the emotional core, as if the tonal shift pulls you out of the world the film is trying to immerse you in. Instead of enhancing the narrative, it occasionally feels like an external layer placed on top of it. Still, taken as a whole, the music does its job. It supports the story, it enhances the mood, and in certain scenes, it elevates the experience just enough to leave an impression. It may not be groundbreaking or particularly distinctive, but it's effective in maintaining emotional continuity. And in a film that often walks a familiar path, that kind of support becomes more important than it might in a more original piece of storytelling. For a film built around martial arts, everything eventually comes down to one thing: do the fights deliver? And in The Karate Kid 2010, the answer is complicated. Because on the surface, there's a lot to appreciate. The choreography is clearly designed with intention. Movements feel structured rather than random, sequences are cleanly executed, and there's a visible effort to make each confrontation feel purposeful. It doesn't rely purely on chaos or quick cuts to create excitement. Instead, it tries to present action as a form of progression, something tied to the character's development rather than existing separately from it. You can sense that these moments are meant to reflect growth, not just provide spectacle, and when it works, it really works. Some of the later fight sequences, especially during the tournament, carry real energy. There's a sense of rhythm to how they unfold, a gradual escalation that mirrors the stakes of the story. You start to feel the momentum building, the tension rising, and in those moments, the action begins to align with the narrative. You see the character applying what he's learned, and that connection between training and execution gives those scenes a stronger sense of purpose. It's not just about who wins. It's about how that journey manifests in physical form. But then, there's the other side. Not every fight lands with the same impact. Some of the earlier confrontations feel underwhelming, either because of how they're staged or because they lack the emotional context needed to make them resonate. Instead of feeling intense or personal, they come across as functional, like they exist primarily to move the story forward rather than draw you into the moment itself. They serve a narrative purpose, but they don't always engage on a visceral level. And that's where the choreography sometimes struggles. Because great action isn't just about movement, it's about meaning. It's about what that movement represents, what's at stake in that moment, and how invested you are in the outcome. It's about tension, consequence, and emotional payoff. And here, that connection isn't always consistent. You're watching sequences that are technically sound, but not always feeling them in a way that fully pulls you in. There are also moments where realism takes a back seat. Certain fights lean into exaggeration, stretching believability in ways that can momentarily break immersion. The physical impact doesn't always align with what you're seeing, and that disconnect can make some sequences feel less grounded than they should. When that happens, it creates a subtle barrier between the audience and the action, where instead of being absorbed in the moment, you become aware of its construction. Even the final showdown, while visually engaging and structured to feel climactic, leans heavily into formula. It delivers spectacle in the way you'd expect, hitting the beats that define this kind of ending, but not always delivering the emotional punch it's building toward. The pieces are there, the setup is clear, but the payoff doesn't fully transcend expectation. It satisfies on a surface level, but stops short of leaving a deeper impact. Still, despite its inconsistencies, the action remains one of the film's more entertaining elements. It evolves as the story progresses, gaining strength as the stakes increase. It improves when the narrative gives it more weight, when the character's journey begins to align with the physical confrontations, and when everything clicks, choreography, emotion, and pacing, it offers a glimpse of what the film is capable of at its best. It may not redefine martial arts cinema, but it does enough to keep you engaged. Every story like this lives or dies with its lead. Because no matter how strong the setting is, no matter how polished the visuals are, if you can't connect with the main character, the entire journey starts to lose its impact. And that's where The Karate Kid 2010 runs into one of its biggest problems. Dre. On paper, he's exactly what this story needs. A kid thrown into an unfamiliar world, struggling to adapt, dealing with isolation, bullying, and frustration. There's a clear emotional foundation there, one that should naturally draw the audience in. You're supposed to root for him. You're supposed to feel his discomfort, his confusion, his attempts to navigate a situation that feels overwhelming. That setup has all the ingredients for a compelling emotional arc, but the way he's written makes that connection difficult, because instead of coming across as vulnerable or relatable, Dre often feels abrasive in a way that creates distance. He's loud, he's impulsive, he reacts quickly without thinking, and at times, he actively escalates situations that are already working against him. Rather than inviting empathy, those traits can make it harder to fully invest in his perspective. And that becomes a problem, because the audience's relationship with him is central to everything the film is trying to achieve. When you don't fully connect with his emotional state, the stakes begin to feel less immediate. You're not always experiencing the story through him, you're observing him from the outside. And that shift weakens the overall impact of his journey. It's not that the film ignores his growth, it's there. Over time, you do see changes. There's a shift in attitude, a gradual movement toward discipline and self-control. The arc exists, and it follows the structure you'd expect from this kind of story. But the transition doesn't always feel as smooth or as earned as it could have been. The progression is present, but not always deeply felt. And because of that, even as he improves, the emotional connection never fully locks in the way it needs to. You understand where he ends up, but the journey getting there doesn't always carry the weight it should. But the starting point is so off-putting that it takes a long time for that growth to feel earned. The film asks the audience to stay patient, to trust that the arc will eventually justify itself, but that initial resistance creates a barrier that never fully disappears. And even when the character begins to shift, that evolution doesn't always feel consistent. There are moments where you can see genuine progress, small changes in behavior, glimpses of maturity. But then there are others where he slips back into the same impulsive reactions, the same emotional volatility. It creates a sense that the arc isn't entirely cohesive, that it's moving forward in pieces rather than as a steady, believable transformation. That inconsistency makes the journey feel less organic. Instead of growth unfolding naturally from experience, it sometimes feels like it's being guided by the structure of the story itself. The character changes when the narrative needs him to change, rather than because those changes feel like an inevitable result of what he's gone through. And that distinction matters, because in a story built around personal development, authenticity is everything. If the progression doesn't feel fully earned, the payoff loses some of its impact. What makes this even more noticeable is how much the film relies on him. This isn't a side character who can fade into the background when things aren't working. He's the emotional center, the lens through which the entire story is experienced. Every conflict, every lesson, every moment of tension is tied directly to his perspective. And when that central presence feels unstable, everything around it starts to feel less grounded as a result. You can see what the film is trying to do. It wants to show transformation. It wants to tell a story about growth through hardship, about learning discipline in the face of frustration. It wants you to believe in that journey, to feel the shift from chaos to control. But for that to work, the audience has to be aligned with the character early on, or at least willing to follow him through those rough edges. And with Dre, that connection isn't always there. There's a gap between intention and execution that makes it harder to fully invest, even when the story is doing everything it can to support that arc. Now, when it comes to Dre, a lot of that experience depends on one thing: Jaden Smith. And his performance is easily one of the most debated parts of the film. Because on one hand, there's effort here, real, visible effort. Physically, he commits in a way that's hard to ignore. The training sequences feel credible because you can see the discipline behind them, the repetition, the control, the precision in movement. He handles the martial arts side of the role with a level of confidence that suggests genuine dedication, and for a young lead carrying this much screen time, that kind of commitment adds a layer of authenticity to the physical aspect of the character. But acting-wise, it's a mixed picture. There are moments where he feels natural, especially in lighter scenes, or when the character is allowed to exist without heavy emotional demands. In those instances, there's an ease to his presence. The performance feels unforced, almost instinctive, as if he's drawing from something personal rather than performing outwardly. Those moments work because they don't feel constructed. But when the film asks for more, that's where things start to slip. The emotional range isn't always fully realized. Scenes that require depth anger that feels internal rather than reactive, vulnerability that carries weight, inner conflict that lingers beneath the surface, don't always land with the intensity they need. Instead of feeling immersed in those emotions, you sometimes become aware of the effort behind them, like the performance is reaching for something it hasn't quite mastered yet. And that unevenness becomes more noticeable because of how central he is to the film. This isn't a supporting role where inconsistencies can be absorbed by the ensemble. He's present in almost every scene. The narrative is built around him. So when the performance fluctuates, it affects the rhythm of the entire film, creating moments where the emotional connection feels strong, followed by others where it weakens. There's also the question of presence. A role like this needs a certain magnetism, something that naturally draws the audience in and keeps them engaged, even when the writing itself isn't doing all the work. It's that intangible quality that makes you want to follow a character, even through flawed decisions or difficult moments. And while Jaden shows glimpses of that, it's not consistently strong enough to carry the film on its own. The charisma is there in flashes, but not sustained. That said, it's not without potential. You can see moments where everything aligns, where the physical performance, the emotional beat, and the character all come together in a way that feels genuine. In those instances, you catch a glimpse of what the role could have been with a more refined and controlled performance. It's enough to suggest growth, enough to show that the foundation is there, even if it hasn't fully developed yet. But overall, it feels like a work in progress, not a failure, but not fully realized either. A performance that shows promise, but hasn't quite reached the level needed to anchor a film of this scale with complete confidence. If there's one presence in this film that immediately commands attention, it's Jackie Chan, but not in the way you might expect. Because this isn't the Jackie Chan built on fast-paced action and playful charisma. This version is quieter, more restrained. There's a deliberate shift in how he approaches the role, pulling back from the energy audiences typically associate with him and leaning into something more internal. As Mr. Han, he carries a sense of stillness, almost like he's holding something beneath the surface that hasn't yet been revealed. And that restraint gives the character weight. There's sadness in his performance, a kind of emotional history that you can feel even before the film chooses to explain it. It's present in his expressions, in the pauses between his lines, in the way he interacts with the world around him. And when the film finally allows that emotion to surface more directly, it becomes one of the most powerful moments in the entire story. That's where he truly shines. In the quieter scenes where the character opens up, where vulnerability replaces control, you see a different side of him. One that doesn't rely on movement or physicality, but on presence. It's subtle, controlled, and deeply effective. He doesn't overplay the emotion. He lets it sit, allowing the audience to feel it rather than forcing it. At the same time, there's a lingering feeling that the film doesn't fully use him. This is an actor known for his physical storytelling, for his ability to blend action and character in a way that feels seamless. And here, those opportunities are limited. The action is scaled back, and when it does appear, it's not always integrated in a way that fully showcases what he brings to the screen. You get glimpses of that capability, but they're brief, almost restrained in a way that feels intentional, yet slightly frustrating. And that creates a strange imbalance. Because while he brings emotional depth to the role, he's also kept at a certain distance for large portions of the film. The mentor figure is present, guiding, influencing, but not always as actively involved in the narrative as you might expect. There are stretches where his presence feels more observational than participatory. Still, when he is on screen, the film feels more grounded. There's a sense of calm, of control, of quiet authority that stabilizes everything around him. His interactions carry more weight, not because they're louder or more dramatic, but because they feel more deliberate. His scenes have a clarity that stands out against some of the film's inconsistencies. And perhaps most importantly, he brings sincerity. A sense that, even when the film struggles to fully align its elements, his performance remains anchored in something real. Even when the script doesn't fully support him, even when the pacing drifts, he stays consistent. There's a steadiness to Jackie Chan's performance that the rest of the film doesn't always have. He doesn't overcompensate for the weaker moments around him, and he doesn't try to force emotion where it isn't fully earned. Instead, he maintains a quiet control that keeps the character grounded, no matter what the surrounding scene is doing. And that consistency becomes essential, because it gives the film something stable to return to. When other elements feel uneven, his presence provides a kind of emotional anchor that holds everything together. It may not be his most iconic role, and it doesn't rely on the physical spectacle that defined so much of his career, but it reveals a different dimension of his range, one that's built on restraint, subtlety, and emotional weight. Less spectacle, more soul. Beyond the two leads, the film leans on its supporting cast to build the world around them, and the results are, once again, a mix of solid effort and missed potential. You can see that there's an intention to create a lived-in environment, to populate the story with characters who reflect different aspects of Dre's experience in this new setting. But while the performances are often committed, the writing doesn't always give those characters the depth they need to leave a lasting impression. Starting with the mother, her presence is constant. She's positioned as the emotional foundation of the story, representing stability, concern, and the driving force behind Dre's situation. There's a clear purpose to her role, and the performance carries a sense of genuine care and urgency. But the way the character is written tends to lean heavily into repetition. The tension between her and Dre follows familiar patterns, revisiting the same emotional beats without adding new layers. Over time, that repetition starts to diminish the impact of those moments. Instead of deepening the relationship, it can make it feel cyclical, like the same conflict is being revisited rather than developed. Then there's the romantic interest, and this is one of the few areas where the film finds a more balanced approach. She's not reduced to a passive role or a simple narrative device. There's an effort to give her personality, to allow her to exist independently within the story rather than solely in relation to Dre. Their interactions feel lighter, more natural, and at times even genuinely charming. There's a softness to those scenes that contrasts nicely with the tension elsewhere, creating moments where the film feels more relaxed and human. It's one of the rare relationships that doesn't feel overly constructed, even if it remains relatively simple in its execution. On the other side, you have the antagonist, and this is where the film begins to show its limitations more clearly. The bully character fulfills his function within the narrative. He creates conflict, establishes stakes, and gives the protagonist something to overcome. But beyond that, there's very little exploration of who he is as a person. He's defined more by his role than by any internal complexity. There are hints that there could be more beneath the surface, glimpses of motivation, of influence, but those ideas are never fully developed. As a result, he remains one-dimensional, more of a symbol than a fully realized character. The same applies to the figures around him, particularly the authority shaping his behavior. There's an interesting contrast introduced. Different philosophies of discipline, different interpretations of strength and control, but it remains largely unexplored. The film touches on these ideas just enough to suggest depth, but not enough to fully engage with them. And because of that, what could have been a meaningful thematic layer ends up feeling more like background context, and that's really the pattern across the supporting cast. There are good performances here. You can see the effort, the intention to create a believable world filled with distinct personalities. But the writing doesn't always give these characters the space to evolve. They serve the main story effectively, but rarely extend beyond their immediate function within it. They fill the world, but they don't expand it in a way that adds significant depth. At its core, The Karate Kid 2010 has never just been about fighting. It's about relationships, the emotional connections that drive the story forward, the bonds that shape the characters and give meaning to their struggles. And in this version, those relationships are constantly trying to hold the film together, even when other elements feel uneven. The most important one, the one everything depends on, is the connection between Dre and Mr. Han. When it works, it really works. There's a quiet evolution there that unfolds gradually, built through routine and repetition. It doesn't rely on big, dramatic shifts. Instead, it grows in small increments, through shared moments, through unspoken understanding, through the slow accumulation of trust. You start to see the dynamic change, from resistance to reluctant cooperation to genuine respect. And eventually, something deeper begins to form. At times, it even hints at a stronger emotional layer, a surrogate father-son dynamic that sits just beneath the surface. It's not always explicitly stated, but it's present in the way they interact, in the way their relationship begins to carry more emotional weight than simple mentorship. And in those moments, the film finds its center. That connection becomes the most authentic part of the story, the place where everything feels most grounded. But again, the consistency isn't always there. Because just as that relationship starts to deepen, the film occasionally pulls away. It shifts focus, loses momentum, or doesn't fully explore the emotional implications of what's been built. Instead of pushing further into that connection, it sometimes settles for maintaining it at a surface level. And because of that, the relationship never quite reaches the full depth it seems capable of achieving. Then there's the romance. On paper, it's simple. A young connection formed in an unfamiliar place, offering comfort and companionship. And to its credit, it does bring a lighter, more human side to the story. The interactions are soft, occasionally charming, and they provide a contrast to the tension of the main conflict. They give the film moments of calm, moments where the focus shifts away from struggle and towards something more personal. But at the same time, it doesn't always feel essential. Some scenes contribute to character development, adding nuance to Dre's experience. Others feel more like detours, moments that slow the pacing rather than enhance the narrative. The relationship adds texture but not always substance. It's present, but it doesn't fully integrate into the core emotional arc in a way that feels necessary. And finally, the family dynamic. The relationship between Dre and his mother is meant to anchor the story emotionally, representing both the source of conflict and the foundation of support. She embodies responsibility, sacrifice, and the reason for their displacement. But the dynamic often leans heavily into tension, repetition, frustration, and misunderstanding that circles back on itself. You understand what the film is trying to convey, but the execution makes those moments feel more draining than impactful. Instead of building toward resolution, the conflict sometimes feels prolonged without meaningful progression. And that's really the common thread across all these relationships. The foundations are there, the ideas are clear, the emotional potential exists in each connection. But the chemistry isn't always consistent enough to fully carry the weight the film is aiming for. When it clicks, you feel it, you see the depth, the authenticity, the connection the story is reaching for. But those moments are intermittent rather than sustained, and that inconsistency keeps the film from fully realizing the emotional impact it's clearly striving toward. But when it doesn't, you're reminded that these relationships needed just a little more depth to truly resonate. It's not that they fail completely, it's that they stop just short of becoming something lasting. You can see the intention behind them, the emotional threads the film is trying to weave together, but without consistent development, those threads never fully tighten into something strong enough to carry the story's weight. If there's one thing a story like The Karate Kid 2010 absolutely depends on, it's heart, not the action, not the setting, not even the performances. It's the emotional core, the feeling that what you're watching actually matters beyond the surface. That sense that the journey has meaning, that the struggles and victories are connected to something deeper than just plot progression. And this is where the 2010 version becomes conflicted, because you can clearly see the film reaching for that emotional depth. It's present in the themes, growth, discipline, resilience. It's present in the quieter moments where the film deliberately slows down to reflect on loss, on connection, on internal change. There's an awareness of what gives this kind of story its power, and at times, the film does manage to tap into it. There are moments, real moments where it lands. Scenes where the film stops trying to impress you with structure or familiarity, and instead tries to connect with you on a more human level. Where everything aligns, the performances settle into something natural, the music supports rather than directs, and the story feels grounded in genuine emotion. In those instances, you catch a glimpse of what the film is capable of when it fully commits to its emotional core. But the problem is, those moments aren't consistent. They appear, they resonate briefly, and then the film shifts away before fully building on them. For every scene that feels sincere, there's another that feels surface level, like it's presenting emotion rather than developing it. It gestures toward depth without always earning it, and that creates a disconnect, where the intention is clear, but the execution doesn't always follow through. Over time, that inconsistency becomes more noticeable, because you start comparing what you're seeing to what you're supposed to feel. The film wants to be heartfelt, it wants to carry emotional weight, it wants to leave an impression that lingers beyond the final scene. But it doesn't always commit deeply enough to reach that level. Instead, it sometimes leans into the external visible struggle, physical conflict, surface-level tension, without fully exploring the internal journey that gives those elements meaning. And that's the key difference. Because real emotional impact doesn't come from what's happening, it comes from why it matters. It comes from understanding the character's internal state, from feeling the significance of their transformation, from being fully invested in their perspective. And here, that why is present but not always fully realized. It exists as an idea, but not always as a fully developed experience. So what you're left with is a film that has heart, but not in a way that's fully formed. You feel glimpses of it. You see the direction it's trying to go. But it never quite reaches the level of emotional resonance that defines a truly memorable story. It touches that depth, but doesn't stay there long enough to make it lasting. Every underdog story needs a spark, something that forces the character to confront their limitations, to push back, to grow. In The Karate Kid 2010, that spark is bullying. And from the very beginning, the film establishes that clearly. Dre isn't just adjusting to a new environment. He's being targeted, repeatedly, intensely. What begins as a simple clash quickly escalates into something much harsher, turning his daily life into a cycle of intimidation, fear, and isolation. On paper, it's a strong foundation. Because bullying, when handled with care, creates immediate stakes. It generates tension, gives the narrative urgency, and provides a clear emotional entry point for the audience. You want to see the character overcome that pressure. You want to see balance restored. And at times, the film does capture that effectively. You feel the discomfort of being out of place, the vulnerability of being alone in an unfamiliar environment, the frustration of not understanding the rules of the world you've been dropped into. It reinforces that fish-out-of-water experience in a way that extends beyond the physical. It becomes emotional, even psychological. But the execution isn't always balanced. There are moments where the conflict feels grounded and believable, and others where it starts to lean into exaggeration. The intensity fluctuates in a way that makes it harder to fully settle into the reality of the situation. Some confrontations escalate so quickly that they feel less like organic developments and more like narrative devices designed to heighten drama. And then there's the dynamic between Dre and the bullies. At times, it's clearly defined. He's the victim, they're the aggressors. But at other points, the situation becomes more complicated. Dre isn't always passive. He reacts, sometimes impulsively, sometimes in ways that escalate the tension rather than diffuse it. And that introduces a layer of ambiguity that the film doesn't fully explore, which could have been interesting. It could have added complexity, raising questions about cycles of conflict, about how reactions can fuel escalation. But because the film doesn't fully engage with that nuance, it ends up creating a kind of inconsistency in how the conflict is perceived. You're not always sure whether you're meant to see it as a clear-cut struggle or something more layered, and that lack of clarity affects how the audience connects with the central tension. Because the emotional response depends on understanding the stakes, not just what's happening, but how to interpret it. When that interpretation shifts without clear intention, the impact becomes less focused. Still, the theme itself remains central. It's the catalyst for everything that follows. It's the reason the mentor steps in. It's the reason training begins. It's the force that drives the narrative forward. Without it, the story doesn't exist. But while the setup is strong, the execution doesn't always give it the depth or consistency needed to fully resonate. It creates conflict, but not always clarity. Every underdog story is only as strong as the force pushing against it. And in The Karate Kid 2010, that force isn't just the bully, it's the philosophy behind him. On the surface, the antagonist is straightforward, a skilled fighter, aggressive, intimidating. The physical obstacle that stands in the protagonist's way. But beyond that surface, there's an idea shaping his behavior, a mindset that defines how he approaches conflict, how he understands strength, and how he's been taught to operate. No weakness, no pain. It's more than just a rule, it's a worldview. A rigid interpretation of discipline that removes empathy and replaces it with control. And within that philosophy lies the potential for something deeper, something that could elevate the conflict beyond simple opposition and into a clash of ideologies. No mercy. It's a philosophy built on control, fear, and absolute dominance. It strips away any sense of empathy and replaces it with rigid authority, where strength is measured not by balance or understanding, but by the ability to overpower and suppress. And that creates a clear contrast to everything Dre is learning. where one side teaches discipline, patience, and self-control, the other pushes aggression, suppression, and emotional detachment. One emphasizes growth through understanding, the other demands obedience through fear. And that contrast is powerful because it reframes the conflict. It's no longer just about who can fight better. It becomes about what those fights represent. Because at its core, this is a clash of ideologies. Two different interpretations of strength. Two opposing definitions of what it means to have power. One rooted in control over oneself, the other rooted in control over others. And when a film fully commits to that kind of thematic tension, it can elevate the entire narrative, turning physical confrontation into something symbolic, something that resonates beyond the surface. But here's the issue. The film introduces this idea, but doesn't fully explore it. The foundation is there, the contrast is clearly established, but it never deepens into something more layered. The antagonist himself remains largely one-dimensional. He represents the philosophy, but we rarely see beyond that representation. There's very little insight into who he is beneath that training, beneath that aggression. You don't get a sense of internal conflict, or even a moment where that philosophy is questioned. He exists as an extension of the idea, rather than as a character shaped by it. There are hints that his behavior is influenced by the harsh discipline imposed on him, small indications that he's a product of that environment rather than simply choosing it. But those hints are never expanded into something meaningful. They remain surface level, never fully developed into a perspective that could add complexity to the conflict. And because of that, he becomes less of a person and more of a symbol, an obstacle designed to embody opposition rather than challenge the story on a deeper level. The same applies to the authority behind him, the source of that no mercy mindset. The philosophy is presented clearly, almost bluntly, but without nuance. It's introduced as a rigid system, but never examined beyond that. There's no real exploration of its consequences, no deeper look at how it shapes those who follow it, no contrast that pushes it into morally complex territory. It remains defined in simple terms, which limits its impact. So instead of a layered conflict, you get a simplified one: good versus bad, discipline versus aggression, control versus chaos. The ideas are there, but they're not pushed far enough to leave a lasting impression. They function within the story, but they don't expand it. Still, even in that simplicity, the philosophy serves its purpose. It raises the stakes. It defines the challenge. It gives the protagonist something more than just a physical opponent to overcome. Because in the end, it's not just about defeating someone in a fight. It's about rejecting the mindset they represent. It's about choosing a different path. And in that sense, the film does come close to saying something meaningful, even if it doesn't explore that meaning as deeply as it could have. There's no way to talk about The Karate Kid 2010 without talking about the film it's standing in the shadow of. Because whether you try to separate them or not, the comparison is always there. The original, The Karate Kid 1984, isn't just a reference point, it's the benchmark. It's the version that defined the emotional tone, the structure, the character dynamics, everything that made this story resonate in the first place. For many viewers, it wasn't just a movie, it was the version of this journey, the one that set the standard for what this story should feel like. So naturally, this remake doesn't get judged on its own terms. It gets measured against something people already love. And that creates an immediate challenge, because it's not just about being good, it's about being good enough to stand alongside something iconic. And that's where things get complicated. Because structurally, this film follows the same path, the same core story, the same progression from struggle to discipline to final confrontation. It respects the blueprint, almost to a fault. But that also means it inherits the predictability that comes with it. You already know where it's going, how it's going to get there, and what the key emotional beats are meant to be. But beyond structure, there's a noticeable shift in tone. Where the original leaned into warmth, simplicity, and emotional sincerity, this version often feels more focused on external intensity. It emphasizes the struggle, the scale, the visible challenges. It has the same moments, the same narrative checkpoints, but it doesn't always capture that same quiet emotional resonance that made the original feel so grounded and personal. And that difference is hard to ignore, because it's not just about what happens, it's about how it feels. And while this version tries to recreate that feeling, it doesn't always reach the same level of authenticity. Then there's the mentor dynamic. Both versions rely heavily on that central relationship, but they approach it in different ways. The original built its impact through subtlety, through small moments, quiet lessons, and gradual emotional shifts that felt almost invisible until they came together. This version leans more into visible emotion, into backstory, into moments that are clearly designed to resonate. It's more explicit, more direct. It's not necessarily worse, just different. But for many viewers, that difference feels like something is missing rather than something new being added. The subtlety that once defined a relationship is replaced with something more pronounced, and that changes how the connection is experienced. At the same time, the remake does try to carve out its own identity. The shift in setting, the expanded visual scale, the updated tone, these elements give it a distinct flavor. It's not simply copying the original frame by frame. It's reinterpreting the same idea through a different lens, adapting it to a new environment and a new audience. And in those moments, it does manage to stand on its own, at least partially. You can see the effort to create something that feels separate, something that acknowledges the original without being entirely defined by it. But that effort never fully breaks free from the shadow it's under. Because when a story is this familiar and this beloved, simply retelling it isn't enough. You have to elevate it, deepen it, or transform it in a way that justifies revisiting it. And that's where this version struggles. It respects the original, it follows it, but it rarely surpasses it or significantly redefines it. So instead of replacing the original, it ends up sitting beside it, as an alternative, not a successor. There's one question that keeps coming up throughout the entire film. Why is it called The Karate Kid when there's no karate? Because from the moment the story begins, it's clear this is a kung fu film. The setting is China. The training is rooted in Chinese martial arts. The philosophy, the movements, the entire foundation of the story is built around kung fu traditions. So naturally, that disconnect stands out. And it's not a small detail. It's embedded in the identity of the film itself. The title carries expectations, associations, a specific cultural reference point. And when what you're seeing on screen doesn't align with that, it creates a subtle but persistent dissonance. It feels like the film is holding on to a name that no longer fully represents what it is. For a lot of viewers, that becomes a distraction. It pulls you out of the experience, even if only briefly, because it highlights a mismatch between branding and content. It reminds you that this is part of something larger, something inherited, rather than something entirely its own. But at the same time, you understand why it's there. Because the title isn't just a description, it's a brand. The Karate Kid 2010 carries recognition, it carries nostalgia. It immediately connects the film to something that already exists in the audience's memory. That familiarity has weight, it shapes expectations before the story even begins. Changing the name would mean losing that instant association, that built-in sense of identity that comes with it. So the film is caught between two choices, be accurate or be recognizable, and it chooses recognition, even if that choice creates a subtle disconnect with what's actually on screen. In many ways, this version feels less like a direct remake and more like a reimagining that's wearing the original's name. The martial art is different, the cultural context is different, the environment, the tone, even the emotional emphasis shift in noticeable ways. Yet it remains tied to the same legacy, anchored by a title that carries expectations from a completely different foundation, and that creates a kind of identity conflict running quietly beneath the surface. Because the film is trying to establish something new, while still being defined by something old. It wants to stand on its own, to be experienced as its own version of the story, but it's constantly being pulled back into comparison. That tension shapes how it's received. For some viewers, it's easy to overlook. Once you settle into the narrative, the distinction between karate and kung fu doesn't really interfere with the core journey. The emotional beats, the structure, the progression, they still function. But for others, that disconnect never fully fades. It becomes a subtle reminder throughout the experience that what you're watching doesn't entirely match what it's called, and that awareness adds another layer to how the film is perceived. Because in the end, the title tells you one thing, but the film itself tells you another. And that gap becomes part of its identity, whether it intends it or not. Now here's where the film starts to stretch things a little too far, because while The Karate Kid 2010 is built on a grounded, character-driven story, there are moments where that sense of realism begins to slip. And once you notice it, it becomes difficult to ignore, because it affects how seriously you take the journey unfolding on screen. Let's start with the progression. You're watching a character who begins as a complete outsider, someone with no real foundation in this world, suddenly thrown into intense training. And within a relatively short span of time, he's able to compete at a high level against opponents who have clearly been immersed in this discipline for years. Now, in theory, that's part of the genre. It's the core of the underdog narrative, the belief that determination, discipline, and guidance can bridge even the widest gaps. But here, it feels rushed. The transformation is there, but the timeline doesn't always convince you. The steps between where he starts and where he ends aren't always given enough weight to feel fully earned. It's less of a gradual climb and more of a leap forward that the film asks you to accept without fully grounding it in time and effort. And when that progression doesn't feel completely believable, it weakens the impact of the payoff because the achievement feels slightly detached from the process that should define it. Then there's the fights themselves. Visually, they're engaging, well-composed, energetic, and clearly designed to capture attention. But physically, they don't always hold up under scrutiny. The impact of certain hits doesn't always match the reactions that follow. Characters absorb strikes that should carry visible consequences, and then continue as if those consequences don't exist. There's an inconsistency in how physical stakes are portrayed, where injuries appear when the story needs tension and fade when the narrative needs momentum. And that creates a disconnect. Because you're watching something that looks intense but doesn't always feel grounded in reality. The illusion holds in the moment, but it doesn't always sustain itself when you step back and think about it. The physical world of the film starts to feel flexible, adjusting itself to serve the scene rather than maintaining a consistent sense of cause and effect. There are also smaller moments that contribute to that break in immersion. Situations escalate too quickly without enough buildup. Reactions feel heightened beyond what the context supports. Certain sequences prioritize spectacle over logic, choosing visual impact over narrative coherence. Individually, these moments might seem minor, but together they accumulate. And over time, they start to chip away at the credibility of the world the film is trying to create. Now, to be fair, this isn't meant to be a documentary. A story like this is always going to operate with a degree of exaggeration that's part of its appeal. It's meant to inspire, to elevate reality just enough to make the journey feel larger than life. But the key is balance. The audience needs to believe in the world, even if that world isn't entirely realistic. And here, that balance isn't always consistent. Because when a film asks you to invest emotionally, it also asks you to accept the reality it presents. And when that reality starts to feel uneven, that emotional investment becomes harder to sustain. The story still functions. The journey still exists. But the sense of authenticity, the feeling that what you're watching could exist within its own rules, begins to weaken. One of the biggest reasons this film feels heavier than it should isn't just the length, it's what fills that length. Because throughout The Karate Kid 2010, there are moments, sometimes entire sequences, that don't meaningfully push the story forward. They're present, they take up time, but when you step back and look at the overall structure, you start to question how essential they really are. And that's where the film begins to lose focus. It's not a matter of having too much story, it's a matter of how that story is distributed. The pacing issues aren't just about duration, they're about density, about how much of what you're watching is actually contributing to progression and how much is simply extending the experience without deepening it. Take the subplots. On their own, they're not flawed concepts. Expanding relationships, adding emotional layers, giving the main character more context. These are all elements that should strengthen the narrative. But here, not all of them are fully integrated into the main arc. Some feel stretched beyond their natural lifespan. Others feel disconnected, existing alongside the central story rather than feeding into it. Instead of reinforcing the main journey, they sometimes slow it down. You start to feel the film drifting, moving laterally instead of forward. Moments linger longer than they need to. Scenes revisit ideas that have already been clearly established. Interactions repeat emotional beats without adding new perspective or development. And when that happens, the sense of progression begins to weaken. Even individual scenes can feel slightly out of place. There are sequences that shift the tone in ways that don't fully align with the film's emotional direction. Some lean too far into exaggeration, others extend beyond their narrative purpose, and a few simply don't connect with the overall flow. Instead of adding depth, they create distraction, pulling attention away from the core elements that should be driving the story. And the impact of that is subtle but significant, because every unnecessary moment doesn't just exist on its own, it affects everything around it. It dilutes the stronger scenes, softens the sharper emotional beats, and reduces the overall sense of momentum. Over time, it creates a film that feels longer not just because of its runtime, but because of how that time is used. The emotional beats don't hit as hard. The pacing becomes uneven. The narrative loses its sharpness. It's not that these scenes are completely ineffective, they just aren't essential. And in a film that's already pushing its runtime, that lack of restraint becomes more noticeable with every extra moment that doesn't meaningfully contribute. You begin to feel the difference between what's necessary and what's simply there, and that distinction starts to shape the overall experience. Because when a story like this drifts away from its core even briefly, it loses some of its impact. It's a gradual effect, but it adds up. This is a story that works best when it's focused, when it stays centered on growth, conflict, and transformation. That's where its strength lies. But every time it steps away from that foundation, even for a short stretch, it softens its own momentum. Not enough to break the film, but enough to keep it from becoming something tighter, more precise, and ultimately more impactful. It's the difference between a story that feels streamlined and one that feels extended. One of the most noticeable things about The Karate Kid 2010 is how different it feels from beginning to end. Because this isn't a film that maintains a consistent rhythm, it shifts, almost in phases, and that shift becomes part of how you experience it. It starts off slow, sometimes frustratingly slow. The first half is where the film struggles the most, not because it lacks purpose, but because it stretches that purpose too thin. It spends a significant amount of time establishing the environment, introducing conflict, and laying out the emotional groundwork. And while those elements are important, the way they're presented lacks urgency. Scenes extend beyond their natural endpoint, repetition starts to creep in, and the story takes longer than it should to find its direction. You can feel that delay. The emotional connection hasn't fully formed yet. The pacing feels heavy. And the central journey, the transformation you're waiting to see, hasn't truly taken shape. It's all build-up, but without enough immediate payoff to justify the time being spent. The film is preparing you for something, but it takes a while before that preparation begins to feel worthwhile. But then something shifts. Around the midpoint, the film starts to find its footing. There's a noticeable change in how it moves, in how it focuses its energy. The narrative begins to tighten, the direction becomes clearer, and the story finally starts leaning into what it's been building toward. The training takes center stage, and with that comes a stronger sense of progression. Suddenly, there's movement, there's purpose. You can see where the story is heading, and more importantly, you begin to feel engaged in that direction. The energy picks up. Scenes become more efficient. The character's development becomes more visible and more tangible. The emotional beats, while still not perfect, begin to land with more consistency. The film starts to feel like it's moving forward instead of circling. It's not a complete transformation, but it's enough to significantly improve the experience. And by the time the film reaches its final stretch, it's operating on a much stronger level than where it began. The focus is clearer, the pacing is more controlled, and the narrative feels more aligned with its core purpose. Which creates a bit of a paradox. Because you're watching a film that clearly gets better as it goes, but you can't ignore how much patience it demands to reach that point. That first half leaves an impression. It slows engagement, tests your investment, and makes the second half feel like a recovery rather than a continuation. Even when the film improves, it's doing so from a position where it has to regain what it lost early on. Still, that improvement matters, because it shows that the film can work when it commits, when it focuses, when it leans into its strengths instead of stretching beyond them. It just takes too long to get there. And in a story that depends so heavily on momentum and emotional progression, that delay makes a significant difference. One of the most defining choices this film makes is where it places its story. Because moving The Karate Kid 2010 to China isn't just a change of scenery, It reshapes the entire experience in ways that go beyond visuals. From the moment Dre arrives, there's a clear sense of displacement. Everything around him feels unfamiliar. The language, the customs, the environment, they all create a distance between him and the world he now has to navigate. And that distance isn't just a backdrop, it becomes part of the conflict itself. He's not only dealing with external pressure, he's dealing with the discomfort of being an outsider in a place that doesn't immediately make sense to him. That fish-out-of-water dynamic adds a new layer to the story. It reframes the struggle. It's not just about learning to defend yourself, it's about learning to adapt, to understand a culture that operates differently, to find your footing in a space where you don't automatically belong, and that gives the narrative a broader emotional context. You begin to see the contrast more clearly, who he was in a familiar environment and who he becomes when that familiarity is stripped away. Back home, there was a sense of confidence, of identity that came naturally, but here, that disappears, and what replaces it is uncertainty. He has to rebuild that sense of self from the ground up, not just physically through training, but emotionally and socially as well. And that's where the setting really works. It gives the story an added dimension. It expands the meaning of the journey beyond simple conflict. It ties the character's growth to something more complex: change, identity, cultural adjustment. It adds weight, making the transformation feel connected to a larger experience rather than just a series of events. At the same time, the film doesn't always go as deep as it could with these ideas. The cultural elements are present, clearly visible, but often remain at the level of observation rather than exploration. You see the differences, you feel the contrast, but the narrative doesn't always fully engage with what those differences mean on a deeper level. It introduces the idea, but doesn't always expand on it. Still, even with that limitation, the setting remains one of the film's strongest assets. It creates atmosphere, it reinforces the sense of struggle, and it gives this version a distinct identity that separates it from what came before. Because while the structure of the story may feel familiar, the world it exists in does not, and that difference matters. Because it's one of the few elements that truly allows the film to feel like its own interpretation rather than just a repetition. At the center of the Karate Kid 2010, beneath all the action, the conflict, the spectacle, there's a much simpler idea trying to come through: growth. Not just physical, but internal. Because this isn't really a story about learning how to fight, it's about learning how to change. And that transformation begins with discipline. The training sequences aren't just about technique, they're about repetition, patience, and control. They strip away the idea that progress should be immediate or exciting and replace it with something slower, more demanding. Doing the same thing over and over again, not because it's rewarding in the moment, but because it builds something deeper over time, something internal, something that doesn't show itself right away. At first, it feels pointless, frustrating, confusing, even unnecessary. You see the resistance, the lack of understanding, the sense that none of this connects to what the character actually wants. And that's important because it mirrors the audience's perspective. You're meant to question it, to wonder how these small, repetitive actions could possibly lead to anything meaningful. But slowly, that perspective begins to shift. What seemed random begins to form a pattern. What felt like punishment starts to reveal intention. And that's where the transition happens, not in a single moment, but gradually. What once felt like a barrier becomes a pathway. What felt like limitation becomes structure. And through that process, you start to see the character evolve, not just in skill, but in mindset. There's a change in how he approaches things, in how he reacts, in how he understands the world around him. That's where the Karate Kid 2010 is at its strongest, when it connects action to meaning, when it shows that strength isn't about aggression or dominance, but about restraint and awareness. That real power comes from understanding, not just reacting. It reframes the idea of conflict, turning it from something external into something internal. There's a clear contrast being built throughout. One path driven by anger, impulse, and force, the other shaped by discipline, patience, and self-control. And as the story moves forward, you begin to see the consequences of each approach. One leads to escalation, the other leads to growth. It's not just about winning a fight. It's about earning confidence in a way that lasts, finding balance between emotion and control, learning respect not only for others but for yourself. And those are the ideas that give the story its purpose beyond the surface narrative. Now, the film doesn't always present these lessons with subtlety. At times, the messaging feels direct, almost spelled out rather than discovered. The themes are clear, but not always explored with the depth they could have had. You're often told what the lesson is, instead of being guided toward it in a way that feels organic. And that directness can reduce the impact because it removes some of the nuance that makes these ideas resonate more deeply. But even with that, the core still comes through. Because underneath everything, there is a genuine arc of transformation. From impulsive to controlled, from reactive to disciplined, from uncertain to self-assured. And that progression, even if it's not perfectly executed, gives the story a sense of direction and meaning. Because in the end, it's not the fights that define the journey. It's the person the character becomes through them. Everything in The Karate Kid 2010 builds toward one moment, the tournament. This is the payoff, the culmination of everything that's been set in motion. The point where training, struggle, and growth are supposed to come together and reveal their purpose. And visually, the film understands that. There's a noticeable shift in scale. The environment becomes more intense, more focused. The energy rises, and the sense of anticipation becomes more pronounced. You can feel that build-up. The narrative finally converging on the moment it's been promising from the beginning. There's movement, there's spectacle. The choreography becomes sharper, more deliberate. Each match is structured to feel like a step forward, increasing the stakes as the character moves closer to the final confrontation. And on the surface, it works. It's engaging, it's entertaining. It provides the framework you expect from a climax like this, delivering a sequence of events that feel aligned with the structure the film has been building toward. But once you look a little deeper, the impact becomes less clear. Because while the tournament delivers action, it doesn't always deliver emotion with the same strength. The stakes are established, but they don't always translate into a fully immersive experience. Some of the tension feels constructed rather than naturally developed. It follows a pattern that's familiar, and instead of creating unpredictability, it reinforces expectations. You can see the progression unfolding in a way that feels predetermined, not because it's cleverly designed, but because it adheres closely to a structure that's already well known. And that predictability limits the sense of surprise, making the outcome feel less like a discovery and more like an inevitability. There are also moments where realism begins to slip again. Injuries appear when the story needs to raise tension and then fade when they become inconvenient. Physical limits are stretched in ways that prioritize dramatic effect over consistency. And while that can enhance the spectacle in the moment, it slightly weakens the sense of authenticity that the film relies on for emotional investment. Even the final blow, the moment that's meant to define everything, doesn't fully carry the weight it's aiming for. It's staged with intention. It's framed to feel significant. But emotionally, it doesn't land with the same force. There's a gap between what the moment represents and how it actually feels when it happens. And that's the key issue, because a climax like this isn't just about the fight, it's about what that fight represents. It's meant to bring together character, theme, and emotion into a single, impactful moment. It's supposed to feel like the natural conclusion of everything that came before. Here, those elements are present, but not fully aligned. They exist, but they don't fully converge in a way that creates a lasting impact. So what you're left with is a finale that works in the moment. It delivers energy, it provides closure, it completes the narrative arc in a way that feels structurally correct. But it stops just short of becoming truly memorable.